The Bible is just a translation of a translation of a translation, and I could go on and on and on and on. Therefore, you do not know what it originally said. You cannot trust it as a source of knowledge about the past, and you cannot live your life on, and that's just what everybody knows. Everybody knows that the Bible is a translation of a translation of a translation, so we can't possibly know what was originally written. As well as that, what everybody knows is that you cannot base your life on some supposed fact that happened a long time ago. That's completely and utterly ridiculous. The longer ago that something happened, the less likely it is that we can know anything at all about it. And it's ridiculous to base your life on something that happened so long ago. Even if Jesus did rise from the dead, and even if you could sort of prove that it's sort of possible, so what? I do not see how that has any relevance to people alive today who live in a very, very different world than back then. Another thing, most churches in Canada today, George, do not teach that Jesus literally rose from the dead. In fact, if you went to most of the churches in Ottawa, probably the majority of them don't believe that Jesus literally rose from the dead. And you folks are just a tiny fringe group who probably don't know enough about how the world works and how to think. The New Testament Gospels are riddled with contradictions, a sure sign that it is not an accurate and dependable history. In fact, people like you, George, do not understand that people back then did not have the view of history, the same view of history as modern people do. They were not concerned with accurate facts. Finally, the last thing that everybody knows. Listen, George, spirituality is about the heart. Whatever gives you comfort. Everyone knows it is not about facts. You are just making yourself look foolish to connect your views to historical facts, tenuous at the best, a long time ago. I could go on. Now, for the record, I spent 6 years in a good secular university getting an honors BA in sociology with a minor in philosophy. I got most of my MA in sociology. I never once had a prof who would have believed the things that I'm going to try to defend and Mike is going to try to defend tonight. In fact, every one of my professors would have accepted all of the things which I just said and would have been able to add a lot of others. After I'd spent my time in a secular university, I went to an ultra-liberal theological institution where they would have agreed with every single one of the criticisms and the objections which I just listed. In fact, I was specifically told time and time again that nothing in the New Testament actually happened, and even if it did happen, it was completely and utterly irrelevant. And after that, you're going to think I'm very weird, I spent 22 years in a denomination where basically the majority of clergy and the majority of lay people would have agreed with every one of those objections and would have said that I'm just represent a fringe view and that you can't in fact believe that the resurrection is something that actually happened. So I spent a very, very long time in circles that would have all supported the different objections which I just made. Now, for the record, the truth that Mike Licona and I will defend tonight is that Jesus really did die on a cross. He really was buried in a tomb, and that on the third day, everyone found the tomb empty. No one could ever find the body. And that over the next 40 days, many, many people in many different locations saw Jesus alive. And that there are not only good historical reasons to believe this, but that in fact, to believe that this is true is the most reasonable and informed position, which becomes more likely to be true the more we learn about the past. And that if in fact this is true, it changes everything. It changes everything. We want you to ask questions. We want you to ask your toughest questions. I am Mike's setup guy, so I'm just giving a couple of thoughts to prime you and us for listening to Mike. And I want to just say a couple of things about why any of this matters. Now, I'm going to read something that's a bit of a snippet from a person who wrote an eyewitness history / biography of Jesus. And what I'm about to read is going to sound very cruel to you. In fact, when you actually pause to think about it, it sounds too cruel to be true. And if you want, you can ask Mike questions about it later. But the fact of the matter is that what I'm going to be reading from this eyewitness-based biography / history of Jesus was in fact viewed as a commonplace. And pagan historians also talked about it. So it's not something that was extreme or trying to paint anybody in a bad light. It was actually just sort of the thing that people all knew happened. And here's what I'm going to read. Just listen to it very briefly. The soldiers, he had Jesus scourged and handed him over to be crucified. And scourge means that they have whips that embedded in the whips, a leather whip, were pieces of lead or bone or glass, and they were designed specifically to do maximum damage. It means that Jesus would have had his hands tied above his head, and it was often the case that they would whip a person with these whips until the bones showed. And it was very common that people would die from this and not actually be able to be crucified. After he was scourged, the soldiers led Jesus away into the palace and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews." And what they're doing here is mocking Jesus. They're duplicating what would happen if a Roman emperor had come back from a victorious battle. And he'd be arrayed in purple, and he'd be wearing the myrtle wreath on his head. And they would be calling him Hail Caesar. And so the soldiers who were watching this man who's been potentially scourged to the bone, and they've dressed him like the emperor, only the cloak would have been a very dirty cloak, kicking around the room, maybe used expressly for this purpose because Jesus was definitely not the first or the last person to be crucified in Jerusalem. So it was maybe very, very much caked with blood and bodily fluids from other people who had suffered the same type of mocking. And again, they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. And we all know that spitting on somebody and spitting on their face is a profound act of disrespect and a profound attempt to shame. And the original language says they did it again and again and again and again and again and again and again. They did it many, many, many times. And then after they would do that, they'd fall on their knees and pay homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put on his own clothes, and they led him out to crucify him. So all of these things that I have just read from an eyewitness ancient biography of Jesus, eyewitness-based biography, is something that Roman historians say happened regularly. It's not an extreme description, it's just that was life. And they start to take him there, and Jesus obviously fell down and couldn't continue carrying his cross. So they took a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. And just as a bit of an aside, I mention this sometimes when I talk about it. It's a really neat thing, but Simon is from Africa. It's an African who comes in conscripted to carry the cross for Jesus the rest of the way. And those of you who have watched movies of very, very brutal groups like the Nazis or Soviet Union, and when people in a work camp can't continue to carry on their labor, they shoot them. But you see, the Romans would never do that because the whole point is that they want him to survive to the cross so they can kill him on the cross. Nowadays, if you see where a McDonald's or a Tim Hortons is, you know that that's probably a good location to start a business because they do good research on traffic flow. The way that we look at where to place a McDonald's is how they thought about where to do a crucifixion. They wanted maximum traffic because the point is to die on the cross. So they bring Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, and they offered him wine mixed with myrrh. but he did not take it. That's scholars differ on this, but it's probably a continued mocking. Very simply, and they crucified him, dividing up his clothes, and they cast lots to see what each would get. And in other words, they crucify them naked, because the point is the maximum degree of mocking, the maximum degree of pain, the longest that they can suffer. And that was the whole point. Now, some of you might wonder, why didn't they see this as wrong? If a member of the Canadian Armed Forces or the US Armed Forces was caught doing something like that to a foreign people group, and it came out, they would be hauled before the press and hauled before the courts, and they would be court-martialed and they would go to jail. If you could put up the first point, that would be very handy. Here's a very important thing to understand. For pagan Rome, crucifixion was a symbol of their glory, might, and majesty. It was not an evil to repent of. We don't understand anything if we read those ancient biographies or any of the things that Mike is going to describe over his next 3 talks if we don't understand this about them. They did not see it as a flaw. A Roman dad could take his son, his young son, to see a crucifixion and say, "Son, there you see the glory and majesty and might of Rome. Way to go, son. Just think of that. All of Rome's glory on display." Why does this matter to us? If you could put up the next point. The symbols and the stories by which you live profoundly shape your life. Or the symbols and the stories by which you boast profoundly shape your life. The symbols and the stories by which you hope profoundly shape your life. If you grow up in a culture where crucifixion is not a flaw or a bug, but a feature, you will live a very different life than if you grow up to understand that the cross is the means by which God, the Son of God, came to reconcile human beings to himself. It will lead to a profoundly different way of understanding yourself and other people. The scimitar for Islam will lead you to a very different way of life than the cross of Jesus Christ. The dollar sign that moves most Canadians will lead you to a very different way of life than the cross of Christ. The empty sky of naturalism will lead you to a very different way of life. The Buddha, sitting plump, with his eyes sort of closed and looking inward, will lead you to a very different way of living than the cross of Christ will lead you to live. Because you see, friends, it all matters. The symbol and the stories attached to them, by which we sort of organize our thoughts, by which we hope and in which we boast, will lead us to profoundly different ways of living. Now, we all want to not just live by symbols and stories, we want to live by truth. We want to live in the real world, we want to live by facts. And we agree, it is why we are here, that we want to live by truth, but we know that mere facts are not enough. I am a Christian because of the facts, but not because of the mere facts alone. I am a Christian because of the facts, but not because of the mere facts alone. If I shot Mike Licona right now, a concealed carry, I shoot him, and then 3 days later he rises from the dead, we would just think that was weird. And in fact, they'd probably make a movie about it. And many of us actually, given the way our culture is, we'd actually probably think he's about to turn into a zombie or one of those creatures from The Last of Us and start sprouting fungi and wanting to attack us and eat us. That's probably what we would think was going to happen, because that's the context within which we would see somebody coming back to life in a culture like ours. It would either be just weird, or it's probably a precursor of a great evil that will consume the whole world. Isn't that how we would see it? If they made a movie of it, that's the type of movie that they would make. Mike is ground zero for something that will destroy almost everybody who's living here. I'm going to survive, by the way, and I won't be as dumb as the people, and I'm just joking, in those post-apocalyptic things. But you see, that's not what Christians say about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. Why? Well, because it's not just the mere facts alone. First of all, Jesus predicted he would die in the way that he actually died, something he couldn't control. And he predicted he would die in that way, and he predicted that he would rise again. And he said that if he does this, this would vindicate who he is, what he taught, and what he taught that he had accomplished. And of course, for those of you who are logicians, you know that does not logically follow, but that's fine. The fact of the matter is, we also know that even though it might not logically follow that he could predict that he was going to die on a cross and die and rise from the dead, that might not logically follow that it vindicates, but it's completely and utterly wise and reasonable. Oh, now we find that the audio guy is watching something else. But anyway, we know that it doesn't logically follow, but we know it's a reasonable thing. If you could predict such a thing and then it actually happens, why not would that in fact vindicate who he is? But there's something even more profound. Jesus linked his crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection to 39 books and to what we now call the New Testament that have become the basis of human rights, science, universal education, democracy, universal literacy, justice, hospitals, care for the poor, freedom of conscience in the weak. It's in that context of that literature that Jesus died and rose again from the dead. And he also put it in the context of words of unparalleled insight into the human condition. Consider the book of Job, or consider something as simple as this. We flatter ourselves too much to detect or hate our own sin. And no work of depth psychology is more profound than that insight about human beings. And it is in the context of all of that literature that Jesus died and rose again, and that it's vindicated. His crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection is not a mere fact, but is a fact that is embedded in deep wisdom that has changed and transformed the world. And there is more, just in closing. If you have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old come over to visit, and you are like at our house where my wife makes a point of having things that, so that if 2-year-olds and 4-year-olds come over to visit, they have things to play with, and kids might like blocks. And if they the 4-year-old starts to make a tower with the blocks, what will the 2-year-old do? Knock them all down. Such it is with every 2-year-old who has ever lived or ever will live. If there is a tower of blocks made by a brother or a sister, they will infallibly knock it down. And the young kids will say and cry and say, well, and your mom or the dad will say, well, build another one. Well, what's the point of making another one if they're just going to knock it all down? And there you have something which is deeply insightful to the human condition. A recent so-so television series, I think on Amazon Prime, called The Old Man. The book is vastly better. Has a female character in it who's asked to step away and to leave something, to quit. And all she says is, how can she leave this now? It would mean that all she has worked for and all she has loved would come to naught and would be meaningless. I have a deep and disturbing truth to say to you. Some of you here might be quite wealthy. 1 second after you die, your net worth is the same as the poorest person in Ottawa who dies. It has all come to nothing. And if you're hoping to live in the memory of your families and followers, I have terrible news for you. I haven't the vaguest idea of the names of my great-grandparents, not the vaguest. You see, we have a profound and deep intuition that death cannot be the final word on human life. It is a profound and deep intuition that annihilation, that includes all Eastern religions end in annihilation. They all do. We have a deep and profound intuition that they cannot be the final word. They cannot be the final word, so that love and justice and beauty and wisdom all come to nothing. If you could put up the final point. The deep longings and intuitions of human beings became fact in the death and resurrection of Jesus. The profound the deep longings and intuitions of human beings became fact in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Mike will provide a positive case for the death and resurrection of Jesus. And he will also deal with the main objections to why we can believe that that is, in fact, a reasonable thing to hold. Why does he do this and why do I do this? Well, because the symbols and stories by which your life profoundly shape your life. And to be shaped by the death and resurrection of Jesus will profoundly shape your life in this life day by day and every day until you come and enter into the new heaven and the new earth for all eternity. And it's because to know the truth that God takes no delight in the death of one who is in rebellion against him, but he longs that you and I would turn from our rebellion to know him and live. Makes a profound difference in anybody's life. It makes a profound difference about how you view money, how you view other people, how you view the poor, how you view war. But God takes no delight in the death of one who's in rebellion against him. His longing is that you will turn from that and come to him and live. And you will begin to live in him. And as the gospel grips you, you will live in him more and more every day until you enter the new heaven and the new earth, where all of the true longings and yearnings and beauty and wisdom of our lives you will see to have been but poor shadows of that glorious reality that God, the triune God, had intended for ordinary human beings like Mike and George and you.